Hello, can you guys hear me?
Hello.
What's going on, guys? Can you hear me? I'm live right now as well, for the record, just so you know.
Let me kick it off. Hello, and welcome. I'm Meron Khalidi for DN25, and with me tonight, two people whose words are apparently so influential, so subversive, that governments are banning them from entire countries to shut them up. Hassan Piker, banned from the UK earlier this week, and Yanis Varoufakis, banned from Germany 2 years ago. What links these two cases? You guessed it, criticism of Israel for its genocide in Gaza. Both Yanis and Hassan were due to speak at prominent events on exactly that. So tonight we dig into this new authoritarian playbook in Europe to protect Israel, how and why governments are doing this, and what all of us who care about Gaza and human rights everywhere can do about it. Yanis, I'll hand it to you.
Well, Hassan, welcome. And I suspect we are being welcomed to your stream as well. So,
Yes.
It's a double welcome. Hassan and I, just in case people didn't know about it, and I'm sure that most of you didn't know it, tonight, Hassan and I were meant to be live together at the town hall at King's Cross in the heart of the city of London. As part of a podcast that I participate in called the Iconoclast. That doesn't really matter at all. The fact of the matter was we were meant to be together. And, Hassan, my intentions for tonight were to discuss with you the way, not just a way, but your experiences in trying to energize the left-wing youth in your country, the United States. And, to try to extract some lessons from you. For the United Kingdom, for Europe, for the non-American world. But of course, the UK government, just like the Berlin authorities 2 years ago, had other ideas. We were found to be insufficiently in support of the genocide. We didn't show enough character in supporting the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians. And, they stopped us from having a discussion about politics in our countries. So, Hassan, off you go.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think I have a lot more confidence had a lot more confidence in liberal democracy and European countries safeguarding liberal democracy in spite of everything that I had seen over the past 3 years. But I no longer have that confidence at all. It's shocking when you think about the history of the United Kingdom and what kind of subversive and, dare I say, radical thinkers the British government has in the past offered a shelter to, in comparison to people that simply oppose Israel's genocide of the Palestinians. I mean, it's a sign of the times that liberalism is in crisis. It's failing. It's deteriorating. And the people who are tasked with safeguarding it, self-described liberals themselves, are also participating in the demise. I think that there are a lot broader consequences that we should probably take a look at and see this as a serious warning sign and hopefully organize against it, because we're running out of time. I think all of these actions taken by the Labour government, taken by the inaction by the Democratic Party in opposition to the MAGA movement in America are allowing, I would say, an appeasement phase that's allowing fascist movements to grow in the Western world. And that's terrifying.
Well, Hassan, I think that you owe a debt of gratitude to the British government because it saved you from this delusion regarding Europe's liberalism. It's a delusion that is a very, touching, that a lot of us used to have. I lost it at least 10, 12 years ago. You're losing it now. It's a delusion, especially amongst the progressives in the United States, who think of Europe as, the kind of United States you would love to have. Even, our friend Bernie Sanders often refers to Sweden as an example of a social democracy, but that's 15 years too late. Sweden is no longer so. Germany. I grew up in a fascist dictatorship in Greece in the 1960s and 1970s. And my parents used to think of Germany as our liberal support group. And we used to take holidays there my father used to say, my father was a communist, by the way, but he used to say that, when he's in Germany, under Willy Brandt and the Social Democrats, he was breathing fresh democratic air. And, but when did I lose my virginity? You lost it now. I lost it 12 years ago, and I'll tell you exactly where I lost it. In the Council of European Finance Ministers, in my first meeting, when I went in there as a socialist, but nevertheless fully prepared to compromise and to be very, reasonable with all these neoliberals. That's right. So I said, we have a different agenda to yours, but this is what Democrats do. They find compromises. And the German finance minister, the late Wolfgang Schäuble, turned around and in no uncompromising terms said to me, elections should not be allowed to change economic policy. And I said, well, that is a godsend for the Chinese Communist Party.
I was about to say, it's very Soviet attitude.
So, welcome to the club, Hassan. Europe is not the paradise the Democrats in the United States would like to imagine it to be.
Hassan, I'd love to ask you, it's been a couple of days since the ban came through. What's the response to the ban been like? Has anything actually surprised you about that response?
I've been surprised on both ends of the political spectrum. On the one hand, I have had a tremendous amount of slanderous articles written about me from a lot of pro-Israel institutions like the Free Press or even the Washington Post editorial board that's like constantly writing about how I'm a dangerous threat to the American public. And because this was such a low bar to clear, and I guess it was a great way to dunk on the Labor government as well, which nobody seems to like, including their own voters. A lot of people actually wrote The Economist, the Washington Post editorial board, Free Press, and all these other oppositional media outlets actually wrote a defense of me and Cenk and a defense of free speech and free expression in general. So, that was a little bit exciting. And then what also shocked me on the other side was there were a lot of right-wingers who had made careers off of defending free speech, which from their perspective, it simply meant apparently to the right to be able to say slurs and the right to be able to incite hate and then receive no opposition or no pushback whatsoever. Because a lot of them, instead of defending the principle of free speech and saying, look, you have a right to say things that I disagree with, that's the whole point of free speech, turned around and celebrated the decision of the Labor government, saying, yeah, this is well-deserved. You deserve this. You deserve this ban. And I found that to be a little bit surprising.
Well, you mean J.D. Vance and Elon Musk did not rush to your support?
No, I'm still waiting on that. I'm still waiting on J.D. Vance because he had conversations with David Lammy and numerous other figures over and over again, warning about the dangers of the UK losing its interest in defending free speech, and he's nowhere to be seen.
Yeah. Can I ask you a broader question? Because, we need to talk about Gaza and we need to talk about Palestine because, they can't stop thinking about it. It's clear that, we were going to go to London and talk about all sorts of other things, but they are forcing us essentially to revisit the question of Gaza. Now, it is my distinct impression, and I want you to tell me whether it is also yours or whether you want to challenge that impression of mine, that, the fascists of the world are doing a splendid job in washing themselves and their dirty hands clean of anti-Semitism by espousing the most horrible, heinous version of Zionism. Is that your view too?
Oh, absolutely. I think there is this very interesting whitewashing and laundering of the prior anti-Semitic history of a lot of Christian nations, a lot of Western nations, and this abdication of historic responsibility where you hear even the likes of Mark Carney and certainly European leaders claim that anti-Semitism is actually coming to Europe by way of migration, Arab migration, Muslim migration. I find that very strange. I find that really funny and maybe a little scary when I hear that from a German leader, especially because the Holocaust happened not that long ago, right? There are still some relatives that were around when that was taking place. I read it as Holocaust revisionism to a certain degree, but it's certainly a concept that benefits Israel's ultimate goals, and therefore Israel is perfectly willing to abide by that. And as a matter of fact, Benjamin Netanyahu himself is personally engaged in Holocaust revisionism when he once famously said that Hitler didn't want to actually kill the Jews until he had a conversation with the Grand Mufti of Palestine, a British occupation holdover that had no real sway over the Palestinian public whatsoever. The Grand Mufti had convinced Adolf Hitler of actually killing all of the Jews because he was worried, according to Benjamin Netanyahu, that if Hitler doesn't kill all the Jews, then they'll go to Israel. this is Holocaust revisionism, and it was panned and criticized widely by Jewish society and certainly Israeli society at the time, and yet it's most commonly deployed nowadays whenever there are comparisons to be made between Hamas and the Nazis, where you see a lot of Zionists openly state that Hamas is actually far worse than the Nazis ever were, which I find to be insane. It's an insane statement to make. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because I had a conversation with LBC earlier before I'm having this conversation with you guys, and the host was a wonderful guy, Louis Goodall. We started off having a normal back and forth, and one of the things that they brought up, one of the things that the host brought up was the fact that I make this comparison between Israel and Nazi Germany. And he said that this was very offensive. It was deeply offensive. And I was like, look, I'm not very precious about utilizing the term Nazi when referencing Israel because they're doing a genocide. It's a fascist ideology. That's precisely what the Nazis did. And by the end of that conversation, which turned into a debate almost instantly, I think he was almost in favor of the ban himself, even though he started off with not being in favor of it. But the reason why I bring that up is because Israel gets to make these Nazi comparisons, but if anyone opposes Israel that makes similar comparisons, especially because it's actually more historically appropriate to make the comparisons between two, much more powerful militarized countries that are engaging in the act of genocide and the paramilitary forces that are fighting back against it, a fight for their existence, a fight for survival, people get very offended.
Hassan, just to circle back to the ban, you were due to speak at Oxford Union. What were you going to say at Oxford that was so dangerous? Maybe you can say it now.
I mean, I don't really know. It was supposed to be a debate between myself and my uncle. So maybe Shaban Mahmoud has a better idea of what I was about to say at Oxford Union. But we're still doing that conversation tomorrow. And I don't know what the conversation was going to be about, but I do know what I have said at Oxford Union last time I was there last year. And that was an extensive conversation around the dangers of anti-Semitism, ironically enough. One of the biggest dangers being the false conflation between Judaism and Zionism, and how a lot of conservatives, a lot of Zionist Jews don't recognize that this personal connection that they present is actually teaching people the wrong lesson, and that a lot of people don't realize that Israel is falling out of favor. And at the time, this was a year and a half ago, it had already started falling out of favor. It wasn't as unpopular as it is now because Israel officially is a pariah state in the Western world now, is viewed as such by the masses. But what I was trying to compare it to is like, look, I'm Muslim. I'm a Muslim American, right? Like in the aftermath of 9/11, this would be equivalent to me running around being like, I love ISIS. Like, and if you actually criticize the Islamic State, like, and their attempts to create the Islamic Caliphate, you're being Islamophobic. That argument is ridiculous, right? And that's what it's going to turn into. And that's only going to foment more anti-Semitism and create more anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, especially when you have advocacy organizations actively censoring people. And then I fell victim to that same warning that I was presenting.
Well, can I jump in here? There is some degree of a distance between us on one thing. Now, there's no doubt that Israel is using Nazi-like techniques of total annihilation in Gaza. I mean, What is the difference between what the Nazis did at the Warsaw Ghetto and what they're doing to Gaza? Not just since 7th of October, but for decades now. Yeah, it's a ghetto. Gaza is not a country. There's no war. It's a ghetto. They're shooting at them as fish in a barrel. They've been doing it now for decades. It's a Warsaw Ghetto writ large, and that lasts much longer. But I still believe, I hold on to the old-fashioned view that the Nazis were uniquely evil. And the reason why I say that is because what the Israelis are now doing in Gaza is genocide, and what they're doing in the West Bank is rabid ethnic cleansing. But the uniqueness of the Holocaust, in my mind, I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, boils down to the attitude of the Nazis, their mindset that remind me of that of a collector. take a stamp collector. A stamp collector wants to collect every stamp there is of the particular, of Bolivia or of Mexico, whatever. He needs to put it in his collection, every single one. The Nazis were exactly the same. They wanted to kill every Jew there was. Before they set out to come to Thessaloniki in Greece, to go to wherever it is they went to wipe out whole Jewish communities, they had, since in the 1930s, the early 1930s, they had mapped out the cities that they were going to occupy. They knew the telephone numbers and the addresses, if they had telephones back then, of the Jews that they wanted to pick up. They were like stamp collectors. Whereas, the Israelis, if the West, let's say, shoves the Palestinians into container ships and takes them over to Nigeria or to Texas or to wherever, I think the Netanyahus of the world are going to be very upset because they will lose their raison d'etre, which is to carry out the genocide slowly. But they're not going to chase them to the four corners of the earth to kill them all. The Nazis were unique in that, but that doesn't mean that I take your point. The Netanyahus of the world feel utterly free to make the Nazi comparisons, but if you make it, or if I make it, we're immediately condemned. And also, the other point I wanted to make that came to me when you were speaking is that this view that the Muslims that arrive in Europe are bringing with them anti-Semitism is pathetic for historical reasons. I mean, the only places on earth where the Jews were completely safe and totally, free, liberated of an anti-Semitic environment, which were those cities? Baghdad, right?
Yeah. The Ottoman Empire was a safe haven.
Salonika, Istanbul. Those were the, Cairo. Those were the places where the Jews never faced anti-Semitism. The moment they came to Europe, it was anti-Semitism galore.
So can I push back on this? Because in a comradely manner. So, two reasons. One, the Nazi comparison isn't to make a one-to-one comparison regardless, because obviously the Israeli genocide has not reached the standard of the Holocaust yet, right? Yeah. But you brought up the intentionality argument that the Nazis were intending to wipe out every single Jewish person wherever they could get their hands on them. And there's definitely truth there. Now, obviously, there's a couple different scholarly debates on this issue in particular. The idea of did they set out to wholesale slaughter every single Jewish person from the start, or did it evolve into that over time? But that's not the conversation that I'm interested in having. The mentality that I have on this is twofold. One, this is the principle of why we have tremendous amounts of Holocaust scholarship and studies in genocides in particular, so that we understand it, we identify it, we recognize the banality of evil, we recognize how societies can turn into genocidal societies and how people refuse to oppose it. And it's the same principle behind the intentionality debate, or the intentionality of the genocide statute. We have that so that we can stop a genocide while it's happening, rather than oppose it after it's done, and then calculate the death toll, and then recognize that it's a genocide if a sufficient number of people have been killed. But the second opinion that I want to put forward is Amy Cesar, who has talked about the non-exceptional or non-unique nature of the Holocaust and discourse on colonialism, where the passage goes, yes, it would be worthwhile to study clinically in detail the steps taken by Hitler and Hitlerism, and to reveal the very distinguished, very humanistic, very Christian bourgeois of the 20th century, that without his being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, that if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the N-words of Africa. And I think there is a similar situation unfolding here as well, where Arabs, by and large, due to Orientalism and due to the dehumanization that they've been subjected to, are not being seen as human in the same way that the victims in October 7 are. Because the victims in October 7, the civilian population of Israeli society broadly, well, they live in towns similar to ours. They sometimes travel to Europe. They have family members, immediate family members that live in our neighborhoods. So, of course, October 7 is an exceptionally unique pogrom against Jews, is the way that it was presented to me on LBC earlier today. So it's top of mind for me at this moment, as opposed to my real slight that could be perceived as anti-Semitic, because I've said Israel is 1,000 times worse than Hamas. And as a harm reduction voter, I would vote for Hamas over Israel every single time. You can only arrive at that conclusion if you think, and this ties up with the Nazi comparisons being seen as too offensive, right? Not by you to obviously, I'm just saying broadly when people say it's like unacceptable, right? Because I think we can have a reasonable disagreement on this, but I don't think you would make that the biggest point of contention at all, whereas some people do. The idea is that some people are collateralized. And in this circumstance, Arabs are collateralized. Muslims are collateralized. There's a justification for why they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, as opposed to human beings that are seen as full human beings are victims, unconditionally victims. And this is the reason why I, brought up the Amy Cesar comparison, because I think Germany itself had participated in genocides that are, mechanized and unbelievably heinous. Belgium as well, and they don't get the same emphasis.
Look, there's nothing that you said that I disagree with. I don't see any contestation there. For me, I'm fascinated by the stamp collector's image of certain Nazis, not all of them, because as you said, in 1932 it was different. I mean, this stamp collector's mentality was very confined in a group of 20 Nazis. But then, as time progressed, I mean, most of the Nazi party in 1935-36 would have been happy if all the Jews were to be evacuated from Europe.
Yeah, Madagascar plan.
For some of them, it wasn't enough. And I think philosophically, this is quite fascinating for me. That when I found out that they had written down whole catalogs of all the Jews across Europe, well before, 5-6 years before they occupied those cities, that is, it's mind-boggling. But it doesn't stop us from making the points that you made, and which are very well taken and received, that, as you said, the Arabs are collateralized. The Palestinians are treated as Untermenschen, as subhuman. There is the other point which you raised, which I think is absolutely spot on, is that, the outrage against Hitler was primarily because he treated the French or, the Poles in particular, as if they were Congolese, as if they were Arabs.
Yeah.
They had no problem with what the King of Belgium was doing in the Congo. They had no problem with what later, in the 50s, the French were doing in Algiers, but not to white European Christians, right?
Yeah.
So, absolutely. I take your point entirely.
Yanis, can I bring it to present-day Germany and what happened to you 2 years ago when you were banned from entering Germany because you were attending the Berlin Palestine Congress? Can you tell us what happened there briefly, and what did it teach you? What might Hassan expect now based on your experience and knowledge in that area?
Oh, by the way, that saga continues. I just heard today that my court case, I've taken the German authorities to court over that ban, is going to be brought to trial sometime in the second part of 2026. And I'm very much looking forward to attending. And it's interesting that I will be able to attempt, even though there was this ban against me. And I would just give you a very brief account of why. Because that ban was broken when BMW invited me to give a keynote speech at their offices. So you see, sometimes capital goes into conflict with its own stooges' outrageous behavior. Anyway,
But we know
There
who
is-
the real masters are, right? I mean, it's ultimately still capital. That's a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So, if Elon Musk wanted to, your ban would have been overturned.
Yeah.
So, but look, in my case, Hassan, I think the reason why I was banned was not something I had said, but because our organization, DM25, we had the audacity to organize a conference in Berlin on the very subversive topic. The theme was a just peace in the Middle East, a heinous crime, right? A just peace in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So what irked them? What made them go through this process of banning me in a way which was actually, it was very clumsy. They were always going to lose legally within their own country. And I think I'm going to win this court case, but of course, too late. I think that the reason why they were so pissed off was because of who the co-organizers were. The co-organizers of that conference were Jews. German Jews who were treated, because they could not be banned. They were in Berlin. They were in situ. So when people like Udi Ratz and various other friends of ours and comrades, Jews, turned up in that conference, one of them was holding a little placard that he had written himself saying, "Jews against genocide." And he was beaten up by police. And while he was being beaten up...
Yeah, an Aryan policeman.
Yeah, exactly. While he was beaten up, he said, "Would it have been okay if I said Jews in favor of genocide?" And then he was beaten up even more. So, that's a difference. In the United Kingdom, it was just a very vulgar application of the rule that, this Labour government can never go against the Israeli lobby. It really is very simple. In our case in Berlin, it was a bit more sophisticated than that. They were essentially banning me to get at the Jews, the German Jews, that did not support genocide, insufficient support of genocide. This is an outrageous crime today in liberal Europe.
And as they call themselves, they're the wrong kind of Jew in Germany. For our stateside audience who may not be aware of this, Germany is still way ahead of the UK in terms of the extent of the repression of pro-Palestine activism. I mean, just look at the case, for example, of Hussein Dugru, who we've spoken with.
Oh, yeah.
DOGRU. You know it, Hassan. I mean, that's just insane.
Well, he's another Turk that's being unjustly maligned by the European Union countries.
But Hassan, I don't know whether you know that in the case of Hussein, we're talking about the same person.
Hussein Doğru, yeah.
Yeah. In his case, what his case demonstrates is that the German state learned its lesson from me. Why am I saying that? Because when they banned me, it was the German authorities that banned me, which meant, as a European citizen, I had the right to take them to the German courts. The German authorities did something, I had the right to take them to the German courts. And the moment I took them to the German courts, they were in a bind because they could see that they could not win that court case. This is why they've been delaying it. The hearing of this trial has been postponed again and again and again. Now it's almost 2.5 years. So in the case of Hussein, you know what they did? It wasn't the German authorities that went for it. It was the European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen that banned him, and she created a delicious catch-22. That is, he's banned from exiting Germany by Brussels, not by Germany. Mm-hmm. So he cannot take the German authorities to the German courts because they didn't do anything against him. So he has to take them to the European courts in Brussels, but he's banned from traveling to Brussels. That is ingenious, isn't it? I mean,
no, it's devastating.
In a much more sophisticated manner.
Yeah, and the sanctions on top of that. And I do find that there is a delicious irony in not just that, but also that recently France got a little bit of the same kind of medicine that they dished out to the likes of Hussein Doğru, where, if I recall correctly, there was a French prosecutor in the either ICC or the ICJ that was victim to the American sanctions because of, their following their job in prosecuting Israel to some capacity, or Israeli officials in some capacity, and Visa, MasterCard, and all of these other American corporations, which dovetails perfectly to your latest book as well about techno-feudalism, decided to abide by American restrictions that were applied to a Frenchman who was a French judge on an international court doing his job, and now all of a sudden he couldn't use his credit cards. And this became a major issue for France because this was a violation of the sovereignty of a European citizen who was simply doing their job. It was the ICC judge, is what my chat is saying. They're correcting me. So that's precisely what the European Commission has done to Hussein Doğru, trapped him inside of Germany and gone far beyond that. As a matter of fact, I believe not only he is sanctioned, but his family is also sanctioned. He has like a minor stipend that he gets. And that's the only money that he can have. He can't use any of his bank accounts. His family can't use any of their bank accounts. So they're genuinely suffering right now in this torturous legal limbo. And again, that is so unbelievably unprincipled for Europe to do. It shocks the conscience. And yet, for some reason, there isn't mass protests against this.
But you know what? You mentioned Nicolas Guillou. That's a French judge. The judge who was appointed by the French state to the International Criminal Court, right? I mean, he's doing the job that the French state gave him, and the French state does not defend him from being debanked within France. He cannot book a hotel room in his own country. And, but you said something that I need to correct to some extent. You said there was a big hoopla in France. No, there wasn't. There wasn't.
I read some articles about it, so I might have a
few articles. But you know what? It's not a big issue. I mean, those of us who are, totally clued in, and the Mélenchon followers in France and so on are making a big song and dance about it, rightly so. But it is not as big an issue as it ought to be. You see, like the rightists who didn't defend you on the basis of your freedom of speech, which supposedly is their number one priority. Similarly, what happened to all the Gaullists? All the right-wing Frenchmen and women who claim to care above all else about French, national pride.
Sovereignty.
They were silent.
Yeah, that's one thing that I find really frustrating when I have these conversations, because I have an international audience as well. And one of the things that is so unbelievable to me is the idea that European states have become total vassals, right? And we saw a version of this when the Trump administration, with all of its bravado, decided to lay claim over Greenland, right? To annex Greenland militarily, potentially. And all of these European leaders were like, what are you doing? This is a NATO country's, territory. You can't do that. We'll give you whatever you need. What do you mean you want to militarily annex it? And there was this big chaos. And I thought maybe this would be an opportunity for some European leaders, some political opposition, with the exception of obviously Mélenchon, to, use this crisis to remind people that, Europe should remain sovereign. Middle powers, when they come together under the banner of the European Union, for example, are actually a fairly powerful force, a very important market, for example. And yet, no, they went back to business as usual. I mean, Macron's text messages, the private conversations that he was having with Donald Trump, showcased their highest priority. He was saying, like, Mr. President, don't focus on Greenland. Let's focus on Iran together, which we now know was also another spectacular quagmire where Europe is once again a victim of its own servility.
Rutte, the former Dutch prime minister and currently top dog at NATO, because he's an idiot, he told a fascinating truth. He let it slip. He was saying this as something which is good. He actually stated it for the record on camera that NATO is not about European defense, but it is a foundation, a platform from which the United States can project its authority, its power globally. So in other words, we're being used as a military base for America to conduct wars against enemies that we don't have, in pursuit of interests that clash with our own. But, Hassan, I have never, because I come from a communist background, and my father. And because I cut my teeth demonstrating against NATO in the streets of Athens in the 1970s, I never had absolutely any illusion that Europe was ever sovereign. I mean, in the case of your parents' country and my parents' country, right? Turkey and Greece. I mean, we were told in no uncertain terms, you have to go into NATO first, and then we'll talk about anything else, right?
Yeah.
In other words, first you grant military bases, nuclear military bases, to the United States of A, and then we can talk about anything you may be interested in. So, think of Portugal, think of Spain, think of Albania, Northern Macedonia, Greece, Poland, all those countries, in order to be considered for the European Union, they first had to kiss the Washington's ring. They had to enter NATO, with the exception of two countries, Ireland and Austria, because that was an agreement with the Soviet Union in 1945 that they would be neutral, right?
Yeah.
So vassalage does not start now with Macron and Trump. It started with the Truman Doctrine
Of
in
course.
1947, which starts with two countries. Remember which? Turkey and Greece.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that because I'm getting messages now, hate messages from my people here in Greece, not my people, from people of the Greek disposition, saying, oh, you are proving tonight, Varoufakis, that you are siding with the Turk against your fatherland.
Yeah, that's what principled international solidarity looks like, where national boundaries are less important than engaging against imperial superpowers and the vestiges of American empire, NATO being one of them. Turks don't say that for me, as a matter of fact. They don't get mad about that, because Turkey's in this unique situation where my father's nation is very anti-America, but it's also very servile to American interests at the same time. So it's always funny to see Turks hate NATO on principle, but then simultaneously continue to have nuclear armed American military bases, which maybe Israel might actually take care of, all things considered, now that Turkey is apparently the next target once they're done with Iran. They've floated the idea of like Egypt and Turkey being the next stage in their endless appetite for expansion.
I don't believe that. I think they have enough opportunities to wage war in the rest of the, Israel, in the end, Netanyahu, when push comes to shove, is going to find some modus vivendi with Erdogan, with Sisi as well. It's all the other populations from Greece all the way to Pakistan that are going to suffer.
But now we're talking about geopolitics. Maybe I can ask you both, and maybe start with you, Yanis. Why, simple question, why does so much of the West bend the knee to Israel? Is it coercion? Is it conviction? What? How much of each?
Well, two things. Allow me to answer in two dimensions. The first one is because Israel is not doing anything different to what Europe was doing 200-300 years ago. It's white settler colonialism, except that it's doing it 200-300 years later, after it was all supposed to be, after white settler colonialism was no longer au fait, right? When the British went to Australia in the 1780s, they looked at the coast of what is today New South Wales, the Sydney area, and they said, we love this. They noticed there were about 5 million, 6 million Aborigines. So they said, oh, well, these are not real human beings. We'll call this an empty land, a land without a people for a people without a land, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's Zionism. And then when they wanted to get rid of the Jews, they said, okay, you go to Palestine, you call the Palestinians non-people, and you call Palestine a land without a people for a people without a land. So, there is philosophical and historical affinity between what the Zionists are doing and white settler colonialism in Canada, in the United States, in Central America, in Australia, in New Zealand, blah, 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 blah. What the Belgians did in the Congo and so on and so forth. So there is the historical, philosophical thing. And then, of course, the British started it all with the Balfour Declaration. And then in 1945, they decided that Israel would serve them very well at the time when they would be withdrawing from empire as an aircraft carrier. Now, in 1947, they went bankrupt. So they passed it on to the United States that took over they took over Palestine and Greece. That was in the middle of the Greek Civil War. Interestingly, the United States government was, up until 1947, it was against Zionism in Israel. And they were against the rightists in Greece during the Greek Civil War. But the moment the British went bankrupt, well, actually were bankrupted by Washington on purpose. They handed over the keys to these civil wars, to these devastations, to these genocides, to the Americans. The Americans took over, and the British and the rest of the European colonialists went along with it. And they were told that this is a smart way of securing monopoly rights over oil, and keeping the Russians out, the Soviets, and keeping the nationalists, the democratic movements of Egypt, of Iraq, of Lebanon, of Syria, of Jordan, keep them down. I mean, that's what it was. And at some point, the next step in this progression is in the last 10 years or so, when Israeli big tech became fused with American Silicon Valley big tech. And now you have, Palantir trains its AI models in Gaza and sells them to the British National Health Service through the Tony Blair Institute. So, it's an evolving human catastrophe, an evolving crime against humanity.
So geostrategy, technology. Hassan, what's your take?
I agree with the historic assessment from Yanis entirely. And I think there's this ongoing debate in American society that, to put into more reductive terms, I would say is like the Noam Chomsky approach. Israel is an aircraft carrier, the materialist interpretation, versus the Mersheimer offensive realist approach of the impact of the lobby. I find myself at the center of both of these arguments because one cannot exist without the other. By my estimation, there's no other comparison to any historic ally that, like the unbelievable amount of power and the influence capabilities that Israel has never been afforded to another country. There's no equivalence. There's no English lobby that is anywhere near as remotely as powerful as the Israeli lobby is. And the reason for that is all of the examples that Yanis just gave. Israel has been afforded the opportunity to intercept and sometimes subvert American democracy by way of AIPAC, by numerous advocacy groups, and a similar problem persists in the UK as well. I was, a recipient of the influence of the Israel lobby in the UK this past week. That's why we're having this conversation remotely, and that would not happen. Like, no other country has this opportunity, and that would not happen if Israel wasn't such an important aspect of colonial expansion for Western interests, for Western capital in particular, in a resource-rich region. So it's a bit of both. But there is an unprecedented level of access, and I think now we're at an impasse. We're at a turning point in this relationship for the first time ever. A lot of people will say, like Tucker Carlson's of the world will say, oh, well, Israel's the reason why we went to Iraq. That's bullshit. Pardon my language. I don't agree with that. I think that it's not a secret that Benjamin Netanyahu certainly was influential and pushed America into going to war with Iraq. But this was events that were set in motion far before Benjamin Netanyahu came and spoke in front of Congress, right? This was pure capitalism, capitalist imperialism. There were petroleum interests in Iraq, and they wanted to overtake the Iraqi government and take away the nationalized oil industry and give it away to private interests. And they did so successfully. It was one of the first ministries and the only ministry that remained intact in Iraq in the aftermath of shock and awe was the Ministry of Energy. As a matter of fact, that was the only ministry that wasn't bombed. It was the only ministry that they went in and overtook. There's a reason for it. They already had the oil maps planned out many years prior to the invasion. I believe since the 90s, Dick Cheney was personally demanding this take place. And they took advantage of the fervor after 9/11 to implement this alongside the expansion of the surveillance state, which we suffer from to this day. But the reason why I say that we're at an impasse is because Donald Trump, not in the second term, but in the first term, actually changed a lot of things about our relationship with Israel. Of course, Israel had always been an influential country in American interest. It played an advisory role in American foreign policy, specifically in Middle East and North Africa. But Trump won in the aftermath of the JCPOA, came in with hundreds of millions of dollars of Adelson money. At the time it was Sheldon Adelson, and now it's Miriam after Sheldon passed away. But Trump won, ripped apart the JCPOA for no real reason. There was very little opposition from the Democrats when Trump did this as well, and that's very important. And there was actually a lot of opposition towards Obama when he finalized the JCPOA, Iran denuclearization agreement. And Donald Trump kickstarted the Abraham Accords alongside Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and they made a lot of money that way. These Gulf countries were already informally experiencing normalized relations with Israel, but they wanted to put it on paper without the Palestinians ever being mentioned once, right? And they tried to finalize the Abraham Accords, or kickstarted it. They moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, making it official, the de facto annexation of Jerusalem, this profoundly important piece of land for all of the Abrahamic religions. And then de jure recognized the annexation of Golan Heights, territory that Israel had militarily annexed. Donald Trump did all of that. And he's even bragged about how the Adelsons didn't even ask about Golan Heights. He just basically gave it to them, right? So this was a big change in the past multi-decade Israel relationship, that Donald Trump had greatly expanded the allowance that Israel had. And then Joe Biden became the next president after him. And Joe Biden did not return to normalcy on any of these issues. And that is precisely the reason why I always say October 7, like the event set in motion, turned this powder keg into what we know as October 7, where the Palestinians felt like there was no other option but to fight their way out, that there was never going to be a peaceable solution, and that they were going to make the occupation as costly as possible, no matter what the cost is to Palestinian lives. And that's precisely what happened. And then Trump came back in, and now we are at the final stage of this relationship where Israel's interests are actually at odds, directly at odds with American interests. Of course, every American leadership has fantasized about dominating Iran, but there's a reason why they refused to do this up until this very moment. There was a reason why, in spite of Benjamin Netanyahu's demands over and over again to militarily dominate Iran, and it'll be super easy, and that they'll be able to destroy this country and Balkanize it potentially, and foment ethnic and sectarian conflict in this country with 93 million people, with thousands of years of history, and rip it apart piece by piece for daring to oppose Israeli sovereignty in the area, or daring to oppose the greater Israeli project. Trump was the one who was crazy enough to do it. And now Trump is the one who's stuck in this predicament, in this quagmire, where it's very obvious to everyone else that he has lost, that America has lost. But the spoiling party here that is rendering a full-blown ceasefire is not the Americans. It's not even the lobby necessarily. It's just directly Israel. Israel is the spoiling party. So I say this is, for the first time ever, a situation where Israel's interests are superseding American interests in a very flagrant, very obvious manner. I don't know if you disagree with me on this.
No, of course not. Do you remember what Robert Fisk, the great journalist working for The Independent, once said? That unless Palestine is free, no American can ever be free. I think that's quite an apt summary of what you were saying. But look, because we are running out of time, I want to ask you a question about your own country, the United States of America, because you are, a great new hope regarding the possibility of radicalizing, especially young people in the United States, not in the right fascistic, misanthropic direction, but in the opposite, in the progressive humanist direction. How is that project going, especially in view of the midterms?
Well, you and I had this conversation in Doha, if you recall, and I laid out my project to you, and you said it's silly, and I should give up and just run for office as a communist, pretty much. And so far, it's actually been fairly successful. And that's part of the reason why I think I'm the recipient of a subpoena, apparently, that I haven't received yet from the federal government, and have been the target of unlimited attacks and smears for the past 3 months, almost 4 months at this point. In our current information landscape, in our current media environment, attention spans are so short. We can't focus on any issue for longer than 48 hours. And yet, for the past 4 months, Fox News has covered everything that I've said on my stream every single day, sometimes 8 times a day at the top of every hour. I cannot believe it. We've solved the attention span crisis for so many Americans, it seems. Now, I'm a Twitch streamer. Why would they be talking about me this much? Well, I think part of the reason why they're talking about me this much and actively trying to disparage what I'm doing is because they are on the right, on the far right, and even the center right that still controls the levers of power in the Democratic Party, terrified of this insurgent movement that is brewing from within the ranks of the Democratic Party through the primary system. I thought that it would be a more successful method to try to build a robust caucus instead of actively trying to fight for ballot access in every single state, and to actually put forth Democrats that are different than the rest of the Democratic Party, the way that the Democratic Party is viewed, and run and win their races, and through good governance and through the hurdles that they present against the fascist Republicans, but sometimes even the neoliberals at the Democratic Party, that they would present a different kind of politics. And so far, it's been very successful. And I've been suffering as a consequence of it. But I'm a very stubborn person, so I'm going to continue doing it until either they put me in prison and I can't do it, or I'm going to probably continue doing it until the Democratic Party says enough is enough. It's now illegal to be a socialist or a communist and run for the Democratic ticket.
Brilliant. Well, I was just about to ask you, all these attacks and everything, does it ever give you pause? Do you think, well, maybe I should tone it down, or does it make you want to double down? But you've just answered that. So there you go.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Brilliant.
Well, Hassan, so that you know, I'm going to suspend my judgment for another 2 years. So, keep doing what you're doing now, but get ready to run in 2 years' time.
Okay. Well, probably. We'll see.
Great to talk to you, Hassan. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you for having me, guys.
Keep going, mate. And, wear their insults like the badge of honor that you deserve.
Of course. Their boos mean nothing. I've seen what makes them cheer.
Exactly.
All right. Have a good one, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.